So I am a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. I am the director, Mosbacher director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Larry Diamond is a senior fellow at FSI and at the Hoover Institution. He was my predecessor as the director of CDDRL and is probably the leading world expert on global democracy. Our topic today is democracy in crisis? I'll give you a simple bottom line. I think it is. And I think that we were going to divide our session a little bit by topic. So Larry, I think, is going to talk about the global situation of democracies around the world. And I wanted to connect it a little bit to domestic institutions and ultimately to things that are going on in American politics. Now, I've had this experience, which I'm sure all of you have had in the last few months. You cannot begin a topic on the weather, gardening, without it getting back to Donald Trump eventually. Because it's been a very peculiar year. You've seen a kind of rise of populism of a sort that we've really never seen in the United States before. You had Brexit prior to that. You've got populist parties in many democracies in Europe. And the question is what's going on? And I think particularly now, the focus shouldn't be, we need to think about the more structural causes of what's been going on, which will therefore set an agenda for what needs to be done once we get past this endless election campaign. So let me begin by giving you my view of some of the structural issues that have really created this situation. So the first one is institutional, meaning that our current world, both in the United States and in the European Union, is a created one that was established many years ago under certain rules, and those rules have not been working terribly well. And one of the reasons I think that you get the rise of all these angry voters in both Europe and the United States is that people think that the elites design the rules for them and not for ordinary people. And there's something to this, all right? So in the European Union, it's clear that the designers of the Union, they wanted to get past nationalism, and they thought that they could just do it incrementally by ever-expanding economic integration, which would lead to political integration. They made two huge design mistakes. One was the euro. So the euro by itself is okay if you have a system in which you've got a unified fiscal policy and monetary policy, but they don't have the unified fiscal policy. Greece gets into trouble. They have not fixed this. This is a problem that has not been fixed. It's been kicked down the road. And it's going to come back. It's going to come back in one form or another. The other big problem in Europe is the Schengen system of free movement within the European Union. Now, as many critics of Angela Merkel's welcoming of the Syrian refugees have pointed out, you cannot have free movement within the European Union if you do not have secure outer borders. And the European Union does not have secure outer borders. And so there's been a flow of refugees, not just from Syria, but from Africa, from many other parts of the world that are going in either through Greece or through Italy. And once they're in the European Union, it's very hard to know what to do with them, which is why they've been trying to push the problem back into Turkey and other places. But again, both of these problems, I think, suffer. They cannot be solved because the system itself does not permit strong decision-making. This is really the issue. The problem in the European Union is you don't have a leader. Germany should be playing that role for various historical reasons. It doesn't want to do this. I think until they fix these problems, it's going to be continue to be a very troubled place. In the United States, I think we also have a big problem that is delegitimating our democracy. If you listen to what both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders on the right and the left have been saying, it's all about interest groups. It's all about the dominance of elites that have done very well from globalization, being able to use the political system and to rig it for their benefit. And the problem is that there's something to this. There's something to this. The amount of money in American politics has increased by more than an order of magnitude over the last 15 years. Basically, if you're a member of Congress, especially the House of Representatives, from the moment you enter office, you spend time raising funds. There's nothing wrong with interest groups in a democracy. You have to have interest groups, but I think there's a wide perception that given the nature of our institutions, these groups have a very disproportionate influence. And that then leads to this general charge that the system is corrupt, that leaders have fixed it. And I think that unless you deal with this problem, you're not going to restore the legitimacy. Beyond that, you've got a problem of inequality. And I think one of the big revelations to a lot of people is that the nature of inequality in the United States is one that's really not been addressed seriously, which is to say the following. When many people think about poverty and inequality in this country, they think about African American inner cities or poor immigrants or other kinds of marginalized people. They typically have not thought about the old working class in deindustrialized areas of Youngstown, Ohio, and that sort of thing, who have actually done extremely poorly, whose real incomes, especially for men, are actually lower than they were for their fathers or their grandfathers' generation, which have been suffering from a lot of the associated social ills that come with this kind of loss of income and status, crime, this opioid epidemic that is ravaging white rural communities in the United States. And that's actually, I think, the face of a lot of the 99% that has not benefited from globalization are in those kinds of communities. Neither of the political parties represented them terribly well. The Republicans, because the big donors and the leaders of the Republican Party tended to represent corporate interests that really benefited from globalization. And the Democrats, because the way they win elections is by forming coalitions of different identity groups. And the one identity group they've really lost any kind of emotional or cultural contact with is this old white working class. They used to vote Democratic back in the New Deal days up through the Reagan years, but in the last 20 years they've all migrated over into the Republican Party. And so these people, I think, are angry because the political system was not representing them. So I think that this is kind of, this sets the background for what we're seeing. These problems, the structural institutional weaknesses, both in Europe and the United States, are going to be with us, regardless of who wins the election. And I think that they have to be addressed in various ways. And the inequality problem is an ongoing one. And in fact, if you think about that, it's probably going to be the single biggest challenge going forward in the next couple of generations, because I think as Secretary Paulson said in the last session, it's fundamentally driven not really by globalization or immigration, it's driven by technology, right? Self-driving cars, I mean, all of the sorts of things that are going to appear on the horizon. In fact, one of my friends who's a venture capitalist here in Silicon Valley said that all of his friends spend 24/7, trying to figure out how to destroy jobs in the rest of the economy. And there's some truth to that. And so the inequality problem is not going to simply right itself, I think. I think that it's something that needs a policy response, but unfortunately, given that it's the march of technology, I have not heard of any really plausible ways of dealing with this in the long run. So that means that we need to grapple with both of these issues seriously. Now, I can't, from my perch at Stanford, I can't give the European Union much advice. I can tell you my opinion of what's wrong. I do think that actually, although Angela Merkel has been a good leader in many respects, she needed to have taken a more forward position in grabbing hold of the basic underlying problem. Germans are very fixated on austerity, and that was not the solution for the euro crisis. And I think they need to take a stronger leadership position. That's something I can't really say very much about. In this country, I do think that the next president has got a very big agenda, both trying to address some of the structural problems with our institutions and dealing with the problem of inequality. I think, so actually Larry and I have both been involved in a project at our center called American Politics in Comparative Perspective. He can tell you more about the reasons we got into this, because it seemed to us that American institutions were no longer the shining example to many democracies around the world, and therefore if we didn't fix things at home, we wouldn't be able to project influence abroad. And I think that there are a number of things that we could actually do to make things better. One of Larry's favorite things is actually changing our voting system to make it easier for third parties, hopefully more centrist, moderate parties, to enter into political competition. I think that one of the big issues in our system is very much embedded in our Constitution. We have a presidential system that splits power in many, many different ways and just makes it almost impossible to come to a decision because so many different parts of our political system can veto any kind of collective decision and have been very active in doing that. And therefore, we don't pass budgets, we don't get immigration reform, we don't do anything about gun control, a whole number of issues where you see kind of majority of Americans actually would like Congress to do something, but it doesn't happen. And so we have to think about changing those rules. So this is the thing, the authoritarian solution to this is to have a great leader who's just so powerful that he alone can fix the problem because he alone understands what the problem is. That's not a good institutional, long-term, sustainable solution. What you've got to do is think about changes in the institutional rules, and I think there's a number of things along those lines that can be done. Getting rid of senatorial holds on executive branch appointments, getting rid of the filibuster, a lot of things that make it harder to come to consensus and give a perch for interest groups. In terms of inequality, there's been a lot of discussions of this, especially here in Silicon Valley. One idea out there is this universal income, where essentially it's kind of declaring defeat in advance, saying, well, we can't do anything about the loss of low-skilled jobs, so we're simply going to have to subsidize everybody, in effect put everybody on a guaranteed income whether they work or not. I think this is a terrible idea because, among other things, why is it that you want to have a job and an income? It's not just that of course you need to bring home groceries and have a place to live, but it has a lot to do with dignity. It has a lot to do with people's self-respect, and if they're being told that you basically don't have a function in our society, so we'll just pay you to exist, that's not going to, that's actually laying the groundwork for a lot of resentment and a lot of kind of dignity politics. So I think you need to put people to work. One possible way of doing that is by launching a massive infrastructure program. Actually, that's something that both Trump and Clinton have agreed on, that this is something that's been recognized by almost everybody that looks at the problem. We've got this massive deficit just in the operations and maintenance of existing infrastructure that by some estimates is about $2 trillion of investment that we need to do. And so this is something that would actually put an awful lot of people to work if you could come to an agreement on actually getting the money spent. Another thing I think we could do lies in terms of our tax code. So as many people have pointed out, we've got this disgraceful tax code that is the result of our peculiar way of legislating, which gives a lot of leverage to particular interest groups. And I think that there's various provisions like the corporate tax rate at 35%. It's the highest, one of the highest in the OECD. It means that corporations are sitting on a couple $1 trillion of cash overseas that they don't want to bring back to the United States because they don't want to have it taxed. And I think that the possibilities for tax reform are really tremendous, where a lot of that money could be brought back to the United States and actually used to invest in things like infrastructure that would actually create a lot of jobs and would do something to dent the inequality problem. But unfortunately, I don't think you can really deal with either of these, tax reform or infrastructure, without confronting, the obstacles to decision-making that exist in our check and balance political system. And so you've got a kind of chicken and egg problem where you need to fix the institutions in order to get the right policies, but you can't fix the institutions without having better policies and so forth. So I guess that's where I will leave it. Larry can, I think, broaden the perspective and talk about the situation of democracy around the world.
So let me begin by now panning out to the world and then coming back to the United States and Europe. I don't know how many of you have heard the term the third wave of global democratization. Democracy, our late colleague at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, argued and showed, I think, in his wonderful book, The Third Wave, has expanded in periods of time, discrete periods of time, when a lot of changes happen together in a period of time, and when one change and one success story of democracy influenced another. And so there began to unfold in the middle of 1974 with the Portuguese Revolution and the fall of the dictatorship there, and then the death of Francisco Franco and the beginnings of the transition in Spain, the demise of the Greek military regime, a series of democratic changes in the world. We didn't know it at the time, but it was the beginning of a global wave of democratization, unlike anything we'd seen before. And then it spread, if you'll remember, to Latin America. Jimmy Carter's human rights policies began to put pressure on Latin American military regimes to change. And then to Asia, the Philippines and Korea democratized, eventually Taiwan would. Then the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall came crashing down, and we saw this enormous spurt between 1989 and the early 1990s in the number of democracies in the world, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but again elsewhere in the world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, which was very much influenced by what had happened in Central and Eastern Europe, and by the end of the Cold War, so that the major powers in the world, Europe and the United States, could now look at Africa on its own terms and not as a chessboard for the Cold War. And the result of these changes was that the world went from a context in which democracy was present in only a little more than a quarter of the independent states in the world. And predominantly, those were the advanced industrial countries, Western Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, a few others like Costa Rica, India, and Botswana, but not many others. It went from that to being the predominant form of government in the world. And by the mid-1990s and the early 2000s, you had a situation where the majority of independent states in the world were at least electoral democracies. That is, they could choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections with at least a reasonable amount of media and individual freedom. And about a little more than half of those were what I call liberal democracies. That is, they had a pretty good rule of law, good protection for civil liberties, reasonable transparency, very vigorous and higher quality democracy. And this was a situation that had never existed before in world history. And a situation I think you think, Frank, was very good for the American interest. If you look at who our problems are in the world, who our adversaries are in the world, who we worry about in terms of potential conflict or instability or threats to our national interest, well, we don't always get along perfectly with our European allies, but we don't worry about them being a threat to our security. We do worry about Russia all over again now, and China, which is expanding its power in the South China Sea and is trying to push the US out of the Western Pacific. We obviously have to worry about Iran and North Korea and Pakistan and a number of other countries that you know about that are either host to terrorism, seeking weapons of mass destruction, authoritarian, badly governed places like Somalia that become failed states, and you can fill out the picture. When we have this kind of dramatic expansion in democracy in the world, we take off the table, off the chessboard, a lot of places that could become dangers to our national interest and have the opportunity to consolidate like-minded states that share our basic values and respect the rule of law and are better governed. Now, they may not all succeed in stabilizing democracy, but that's been the challenge of the last 2 to 3 decades, is to facilitate and help to expedite that transition to deep, consolidated, liberal, stable democracy. And it looked like that's the way the world was going from the end of the Cold War. I'm tempted to say the end of history, but in a very particular way. You know, through the early 2000s, we had reached a point by the late 1990s, early 2000s, where democracy was no longer, and today is no longer, a Western phenomenon. It is a universal phenomenon. Not only all the states of the European Union, although this is now a problem that I will come back to, but you know, most of the states of Latin America, about 40% in Asia of the independent states, and at least a third of the states in sub-Saharan Africa could be called electoral democracies. And some of them are doing better than others, but they choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. And it is a situation that is better for human rights, better for our values, better for our national interests, hopeful for the world, and was looking hopeful until the early 2000s. And something changed. If I had slides, I could show you, but you can kind of see the, you know, the gradual ascent of democracy, the rapid ascent after the Cold War, then a more gradual ascent again. My arm isn't long enough to show this wonderful trend. And then it just stops at around 2005. And for the last 11 years, there has been no continued progress of democracy and freedom in the world. But worse than that, we have seen an erosion of civil liberties and political rights, a resurgence of corruption, and much more seriously, resurgence of authoritarian norms and practices. So the authoritarian states of the world were put on the defensive by a lot of the color revolutions that toppled authoritarian regimes in places like Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine. Putin was extremely worried this was going to happen to him. He became really unnerved by the protests that accompanied the electoral fraud after the parliamentary elections in late 2011. The Chinese, of course, were traumatized by the Tiananmen protests and swore to themselves that that would never be allowed to happen again. And if you've ever been to Tiananmen Square since then, I think you can see if political order starts unraveling in China again as a result of popular protests, Tiananmen Square isn't going to be the site of it because it's just crawling with covert cameras and security officers. But in any case, they understood the playbook. They mastered the playbook, and they wrote their own playbook of laws that made it much more difficult for us to assist democratic organizations, think tanks, independent media, with the kind of financial, technical, political, and training assistance we had been offering for the previous 25, 30 years. Frank is on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, so he sits on the board of one organization that's been making many of these grants for quite a long time now. It's now really a criminal offense in many of these countries to receive this kind of, you know, transparent financial and technical assistance. And this is only one of a number of ways in which the regimes are becoming more authoritarian, more assertive, more vigilant against any kind of democratic protest, democratic pluralism, democratic mobilization. Another is that they have become much more effective, much more innovative, much more comprehensive in surveilling and censoring the internet, which of course, the internet and social media was a very important medium tool for democratic protest, exposure of authoritarian wrongdoing, the creation and extension of a civil society, and the organization of protest. And they are increasingly, energetically, and I'd even say ruthlessly, preempting it. I do want to say, since we're sitting in the Silicon Valley, they are doing so in part with American technology, and technology that has been invented here in the United States. There's now a big debate about a Silicon Valley company that exports much of this technology, which is, of course, dual-use technology, right? It can be used to track and try to burrow down into the information networks of organized crime, of terrorist networks. So the unfortunate problem we face with freedom in the world is we want these tools to surveil and control and expose all the bad people out there trying to threaten us and international order, but we don't want autocrats like Putin or now President Erdogan in Turkey to be able to get a hold of this technology, which an American company has seen a number of its employees quit in protest over its intention to export this technology now to an increasingly blatantly authoritarian regime in Turkey. So you've had this trend as well. And accompanying this have been growing problems of democracy, frustrations of democracy in many of the countries that acquired democracy during this third wave. Some Asian countries, you've been reading about what's been happening in the Philippines under the new presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, who's now been presiding over an authoritarian, brutal wave of state-sponsored and vigilante violence that has seen over 3,000 people killed on the streets of probably mainly Manila, but other cities in a crackdown against so-called drug trafficking and other crime, and also even drug usage. These are extrajudicial executions that have no basis in the law of any kind. You've seen the military coup in Thailand. We've seen the descent of Turkey into a blatantly authoritarian state. And we've seen, this becoming a pattern during these last 10 years, but particularly at an accelerating rate last few years, of a growing pace of democratic breakdowns. And so you have now, I'd say, several big trends that are converging into a moment that we have not seen in 40 years that I think is a moment of particular and accelerating danger for the world and the American national interest. And so let me just summarize these and say a word back about the situation in the West. The first is that, it's not easy to make democracy work, particularly in a low-income setting with weak institutions. And so in parts of Asia, even more so in sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing a lot of slippage and erosion of democratic institutions, usually actually not by military coup, but by the way that Putin and Erdogan have done it. You just have an elected president misuse the law, misuse the institutions, punish the opposition in a way that becomes so comprehensive that you no longer have democracy. Second, as I said, we have an authoritarian resurgence where it is the authoritarian states of the world, Russia, China, Iran, that are feeling expansive, self-confident, with the technological momentum, increasingly politically, almost self-righteous and contemptuous of the West. Third, why are they able to pull that off? Because of all the problems that Frank was referring to in terms of the polarization, dysfunction, accelerating populism, and, inability of democracies in the European Union and the United States to effectively manage their problems, whether it's immigration, whether it's the renewal of infrastructure, which is a problem Frank has really been concerned about, economic management, social cohesion, education, we could go on and on. And then I would add the growing number of failed states, and we saw what happened to the Arab Spring. So it's a time when democracy, which had so much prestige, which had a kind of normative and ideological hegemony in the world for about 20 years as clearly the best form of government, the way the world is going, that's no longer the sense out there. And I worry that if we don't kind of adapt and re-energize our own policies to promote and advance and defend democracy around the world, not promote it the way we did in Iraq, but peacefully through cross-border cooperation and solidarity. And in particular, if we don't improve our own democracy and make it more functional and more effective in some of the ways that Frank was talking about and that we've been studying in our American democracy program at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, we're going to be, if we don't do these things, in a very rough and much more difficult period for freedom and democracy in the world.
Okay, so Larry, maybe you can look through the questions. I'll make one comment on that. It seems to me that one of the big new things that's going on, so there, as Larry said, there are these authoritarian states that are feeling their oats and are very self-confident. What's a little bit more troubling to me is the fact that the threats to democracy are actually coming from within established democracies now. And I would put the problem in the following way, that liberal democracy is really two different sets of institutions. It's popular choice through elections, and it's a rule of law that protects an open and equal legal system and rights for individuals. And what you're seeing increasingly is popularly elected leaders like Putin, like Erdogan, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who are using their democratic electorates to erode the rule of law. And I think that this is unfortunately something that is a real threat in the bastions of liberal democracy in Europe and even here now in the United States. And so that balance between democracy and liberalism, I think, is one that we're going to have to really kind of push back on and make sure that it does stay in balance. Okay.
One of the questions was about whether it's just a coincidence that this, someone must have been reading my work, this downturn in democracy, kind of coincided with the invasion of Iraq. And I think I've already spoken to that, that no, I don't think it's a coincidence. But the causal connection, I think, is that because we didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the kind of legitimation of our major and costly intervention there was to promote democracy, two things happened. First of all, it didn't go well. So a lot of people in Europe and the United States asked, well, maybe we can't do it. Why are we doing this? This is a difficult place. Maybe it's not really a feasible task. But even more so, there was a reaction that said, well, if this is democracy promotion, invading and conquering and trying to administer and state build in another country, we want no part of it. And I think it contaminated the term democracy promotion, took people off the focus of the main thrust of democracy promotion efforts, which are much more in the vein of the National Endowment for Democracy and political assistance and economic development assistance efforts of USAID, the Agency for International Development, and other development assistance organizations in Europe and elsewhere. Okay, so question for you, Frank. I think you're going to like this. There was a 2014 Princeton study, I think you know what it is, that found that America has become an oligarchy, not a democracy. So what do you think of that study? And, you know, if you think that it has validity, how do we restore our founding principles in the United States, which would certainly did not, in a way, really intend for us to be a democracy either. They used the word republic for a very specific reason, but they certainly didn't want oligarchy. So what do you think of that?
Well, I don't buy that. I think that we have a country that's got oligarchs, but it's not an oligarchy. And I think that actually this election season proved that because the big money, you know, wanted, on the one hand, Hillary Clinton, and on the other, someone like Jeb Bush. You know, Jeb Bush started with $150 million in his war chest. And if you could translate big money into political influence all that easily, you shouldn't have had the election campaign or the primary campaigns that you did, where Hillary was very, very seriously challenged by Sanders, and Donald Trump completely upended all of the establishment candidates. So I actually think that there's a sunny part to the dark cloud that's represented by the Trump campaign, which is that actually democracy still matters, that people can mobilize on a popular basis. And in fact, I don't think you can fix some of the problems, the institutional problems with money in politics that we face, unless you've got a bunch of angry people that are mobilized and want to fix things. I just think you need the right leadership, and you've got to have the right set of policies to do it, which unfortunately I haven't really seen coming out of either of the campaigns, and certain of the things that have been proposed will actually simply make things worse. That doesn't mean that we still don't have a big problem of representation, meaning that people with a lot of money, well-organized groups, and by the way, they're not all exclusively, you know, this donor, I mean, kind of conservative donor class. I mean, some of them are constituencies of the Democratic Party as well. But a lot of that is, you know, overrepresents people with money and with good organization. And I think that that's one of the problems that we have to fix if we're going to restore the legitimacy of American democracy.
So I will just add that I think the issue you pointed to of inequality is just hugely important, and it is creating a situation where more people than the one who wrote this question think we're kind of approaching a kind of at least flavor of oligarchy. And the dilemma we live in now is that, you know, one way to level it is through, frankly, taxation and redistribution, which is why I, you know, believe in a progressive income tax. But, you know, we live in a world where capital is highly mobile. In fact, you've spoken about the potential to do something creative in bringing a lot of the capital back that's overseas, but then that requires, in a way, a tax holiday of some kind or lower taxes. Maybe just say something about that before we move to the next question.
Well, there's a lot of ways you can repatriate that. I think the most straightforward one that would be actually revenue neutral is to try to get rid of all of the subsidies and tax breaks. You know, there's this huge submerged state. Suzanne Mettler, a political scientist at Cornell, coined that term, where, especially on the right, people think that if you create a tax exemption, somehow that's not spending, and that's a legitimate thing. And so the tax code is full of carve-outs for various kinds of special interests, as well as subsidies of various sorts. So I think the basic idea would be to get rid of all of that and simply have lower nominal rates that would then encourage a kind of even playing field for investment. Other ideas, if you can't get actually that kind of a big tax reform, which is going to be very difficult given the power of interest groups, is simply to lure it home through something like a tax holiday. And I think that might, you know, that might work. If I mean, there's an idea out there that if people agree to bring, if corporations like Apple, you know, agree to bring home substantial amounts of cash held overseas, it could be put into a trust fund that would, you know, rebuild highways or something like that, that might be a deal that would be politically feasible given the other limitations of our current political system.
Okay, so we're talking about leadership. That's a natural segue into this question. I'm sure this will resonate in this room. Is there not room for a transformational president again? A Lincoln, a Teddy Roosevelt, an FDR, an LBJ? Now, I will say this is on our minds because we just had a seminar yesterday at our center where one of our colleagues at Stanford, Terry Moe, who's just written a new book, I'll give it a call out, Relic, about the constitutionally weak character of the American presidency, was saying, basically presidents have really not been very transformational in history. That's kind of an illusion, and we're not going to get there unless we change the Constitution. But in any case, do you think it is possible to have a transformational president again in the United States, given our current culture, our current institutional arrangements, and if not, what might be changed to enable it?
I don't see any obstacle to that. So if you think about the 1930s, you had a much more severe economic crisis. You had 20% unemployment in the United States. You had huge setback in terms of, the collapse of the banking system in the early 30s and so forth. And people were really, really angry. They were marching on Washington. There were strikes, throughout the industrial sector. And then you had pretty good leadership. Roosevelt actually regarded himself as a transformational leader that was bringing in ideas about the use of the state to actually correct the excesses of capitalism in a way that no American president had even considered before. And so he was able to harness that anger. And so that's why I think that, what political change, what political will consists of, it's a bad metaphor in my view because it places all the onus on an individual. What you really need is several things. So you need the grassroots. If you don't have grassroots mobilization, you're never going to get real political change. You need a leader that can channel that into actually productive change, and then you need an idea such that the change that you get are policies that will actually fix some of the underlying problems. Right now in the United States, all you've got is the grassroots anger. It's a beginning, but it's being channeled in all of these very unproductive ways. You don't have good leadership. And frankly, to deal with some of these underlying issues, the inequality and the structural institutional problems with our system, I haven't heard very many good ideas. And so I think you got to get all three of them together in order to really get serious reform.
Let me ask you one quick question to follow up, and then I'll try and answer 2 or 3 questions about democracy in conclusion. If you have grassroots mobilization, well, we certainly do, right? It's increasing. I mean, part of the Trump phenomenon is grassroots mobilization. You can't even begin to understand Bernie Sanders without understanding the grassroots character of it. And many of the left and right populist, left of center and extreme right of center populist movements in Europe have been all about grassroots mobilization. So the problem is a lot of the solutions that might change things involve kind of synthetic solutions, kind of getting outside of the left-right, well, maybe you don't agree with that even, framework, but how do you, straddle the line between the need for civic engagement and popular mobilization and the danger that that could lead to populism and kind of extremist tendencies?
Well, I mean, the thing is we got populism and extremist tendencies already. It's already being channeled. So, I mean, the question is whether you can grab some of that anger and actually turn it in a more productive direction. And, I think in the end, sometimes we may tend to underestimate whether people can actually be persuaded by arguments. And I think the thing is that nobody's been making a real argument. For example, how do you really get money out of the campaign finance system, that are going to require some measures way beyond the sorts of very incremental things that we've done up to this point. So I wouldn't give up on being actually able to channel some of that anger.
And I wouldn't either, because we did it once in the early 20th century with the progressive movement in the United States, and that's how we got a lot of the reforms that made American democracy work better then. So a number of these questions relate to kind of what happened in the Arab Spring, the state of democracy now, why democracies broke down, and then the future of democracy. So we have only 2 minutes left for me to cover those 4 questions. So let me make the following bullet points. Number 1, of course, the Arab Spring has been a failure, okay? We need to acknowledge that. 6 countries had, shattering popular uprisings. 3 Arab countries saw their longstanding dictators toppled in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. In 2 others, you've got essentially civil war in Yemen and Syria, and Bahrain, the Saudis came in and restored their version of order. But, with Tunisia, you've got one more democracy in the Arab world that you had before, and it is making some progress, and it does provide hope. And if you look at the public opinion survey data from the Arab world, you don't find that people no longer want democracy. They think it's been a horrible failure. What you find is a very sobering realization that disruptive change, radical and revolutionary change, is very risky and can go very bad. And what they'd like is incremental change, incremental reform toward greater participation, greater accountability, and eventually democracy. It's actually the monarchies of the region, and now probably best positioned, Jordan and Morocco, that are in a position to do that. But the irony is that, it's very rare when an absolute monarch decides to tie the king's hands, in the language of our literature, and accept a constitutional order, and it never happens without popular mobilization and pressure to induce them to do so. Finally, I'm being asked 70 years from now, will the majority of countries be democratic, or even more so, or are we headed back to authoritarian rule? I don't think my record of looking 20 years ahead is all that great, so I don't know about 70. But I will say this in conclusion. Maybe we can end on a positive note here, since it's been a lot of worry and concern in our conversation. I think if you look at the public opinion data, and even now I'll focus on the public opinion data, which I'm literally immersed in, and it's some of the best public opinion survey data, ironically, that we have in comparative politics from sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region of the world. What you see is a really profound, and I think likely to be lasting change in norms, in values, in the way people think. People, even who have low levels of education in Africa, and that this isn't actually as true in Asia, but there's still a lot of validity to this in Asia, and more so in Latin America. They want freedom. They have seen that when presidents have no constraints on their power, no really strong constitutional norms, no rule of law, power can be abused, the wealth of the country can be stolen, the development promise of the country can be robbed. And elites can do all sorts of things to, kind of steal this, divert this, temporarily move in an authoritarian direction. But I think there's been a lot of significant cultural change, and there's a lot of vibrancy at the level of civil society. So actually, this gives me very considerable hope about the future of democracy, because I think it's actually much more consistent with basic impulses in human nature to want freedom and autonomy, and it is still very embedded in international norms and values. Thank you all for spending this time with us.